Good afternoon. I am Anto Budiarjo. Welcome to Monday Live. This is something that we do every Monday afternoon to try and figure out what the future is for smarter buildings. We are listed on mondaylive.org, just in case you're wondering who we are. And also to note that views expressed here are personal, not of any company or organization. And let's have lively chat on the Zoom chat for questions, comments, and anything else that you want to share. And also this slide deck is available on mondaylive.org right there on the homepage if you want anything from the slide. So we are starting a new month today, the month of June. And we're going to be talking about networks, especially what would make a network be smarter, since we're into smarter buildings and all that kind of stuff. So that's the aim for this month. And we'll start all of that with our agenda of today, news and trends and chit chat, and then really on the smarter networks, really do a bit of brainstorming as to why networks are so important, which may sound like a silly question. But anyway, I thought I'd pose a silly question to get us going. But before we do that, Ken, what's going on in your world?
Okay, thanks. I just finished my article for Contractor Magazine, and I've called it Navigating the Noise of the New Era. How do we navigate the unknown, the never land of what has not been done with new tools we've never used? We're kind of jumping into a whole new era. I've attempted to try and coin this as the environmentation era. So my advice as an old sailor is to steer the course in a confused sea. And I see this as definitely a confused sea. There's a lot of stuff going on in a lot of directions. And I think it's important for us all as an industry to remember what it is we do, even though there's all these new tools and different ways of doing things. Ultimately, we're going to end up doing very similar stuff that we've been doing for the last bunch of years. So I think that's a message that I kind of want to get out to the industry. Inside of this article is included my keynote from ControlCon, which basically just talks about the eras I've seen in the past and how they've changed us. So if anybody wants to give a listen to that, it's available at that link. And I've again tried to coin this word environmentation as the combination of environment and automation. And this makes us environmentalists, which is an interesting, something new. Environmentation is a company that we started before automated buildings that crashed and burned 30 years ago. But the basic requirements or the story of the reason that it was created is sort of similar to what is happening now. So I find that a bit of a interesting play. We also got this great article from Anto on the cloud. And it's great because he steps through all of the clouds. And I believe that very much this is where AI will enter the buildings, is through the IBB. And this is a excellent primer, or sets the scene. And I think it'll help some of the naysayers that think the world will end when AI takes over, to understand that there is technologies in place, and basically AI is just going to help with the decisions. Ultimately, the control, it will be done in a very similar manner as it's been done forever. I think I point out in my keynote that we're still using pneumatics. Eventually we do all these great decisions, but we eventually send some air out to a valve, and open valve or close a valve or a damper to actually make the thing change. So anyway, back to you. That's what's happening. Automated.
Thank you. Thank you, Ken. Rick.
I just updated this, so darn. I just updated it real time. Is this So this is the old slide.
This is the new slide. I updated it for you.
Oh, really? Okay, so we did a presentation for the big organization on 6/1, and the recording is ready. And it's a pretty good summary of the different things that the coalition is highlighting as priorities, and then it kind of goes in depth on our message around cloud native, IBB 2525. And so for those who weren't on the big call and want to go look it up, please do that. That messaging is going to be sort of core for what we're doing at these other presentations, including Haystack and Realcomm, and then the other presentations throughout the rest of the summer. I did want to, I'm going to jump to, well, I don't see it on here. I tried to update it, sorry. The young professionals are going to have their first in their webinar series, their summer series of webinars. It'll be coming up on June 27th, I believe, and everybody's welcome to participate in that. The first session is going to be a discussion again around AI, again oriented more towards the young professionals' questions about that. So if you haven't seen a link to that, shoot Monica a message asking for that flyer that has been created to talk about the young professionals summer webinar series.
Great. Thank you, Rick. I had a couple of things. First, on the left, an article talking about the return to office and that whole sort of thing, and it's quite interesting because it's actually well, the conclusion is right here. Spoiler alert. We're basically going into a hybrid mode. It's kind of what it's saying, but it's sort of interesting the way it sort of comes to that. It sort of discusses what people's thoughts are about going to work, and obviously what the companies are doing. Just those two things are clearly in conflict, and hybrid seems to be the compromise or the stalemate, as it puts it. So quite interesting. The other piece on the right-hand side is just the number of IoT devices continuing to grow, 16.7 billion this year, which actually doesn't sound as big as it could be, but that's obviously interesting. And how it's being connected is interesting. And what I thought was interesting about his specifically is the Bluetooth. I didn't think Bluetooth connectivity, and this is good because we're talking about networking this month. I didn't think Bluetooth connectivity for smart devices was as big as it is. Clearly, a lot of that is in homes. So, wondering how much, whether that's a trend that we got to look out for in the commercial space. So, a couple of sort of interesting stuff there. Oops, some other links, normal, and opening up to any other thoughts. Anybody else want to chime in?
Yeah, just to support your hybrid thing there. And so I heard only this week that there's a large area just outside the city in London, which is called Canary Wharf, and one of the kind of primary buildings that it's always been built around is the HSBC building. I spoke to someone the other day who said huge amounts of the floors are empty, and actually HSBC are going to move out of that building because they're not actually fully using it and are now looking for somewhere else. So that would be quite a real significant thing, which is basically boiling down to hybrid, because they're just not using the space they did previously. It's not like they've cut staff or things like that. It's just really is a move for people working at home.
So just to weigh in on that, I was listening to a financial broadcast last week for this office building market, particularly from the perspective of the REITs that are out there, that there's going to be, this particular speaker was basically saying that the REITs, a number of them are going to be in serious trouble because their portfolios are so heavily weighted in the commercial office space, and particularly in the U.S., a lot of the funding comes from regional banks, and those regional banks are heavily exposed. So when these office properties no longer become viable, and then the loans become affected, there's going to be a real domino effect that's going to hurt a lot more banks than the press is currently talking about right now. And then there's going to be fallout among a lot of the REITs who aren't going to be able to manage this decline, this sudden decline. So it's yeah, to the point you made in your slide, Anto, is that people don't want to go back to the office in large quantities, and there's sort of no changing that is the conclusion. And so the ripple effect is going to happen here in the commercial space, commercial office space specifically.
Yeah, we've been talking about this. I don't mean just us, but I think the whole world's been talking about this for a year and a half. And I think it's finally sort of settling down to somewhere in between. People are not going to go back totally, and people want to stay at home. And so the hybrid, it's sort of landing in the middle, landing. We're starting to see what it's going to look like.
Yeah, I think people have been hanging in there with their leases because they weren't quite sure what to do as well. And I think as those leases come to an end, that's when those decisions will be made about changing perhaps the properties they're in, or reducing it, or how they manage it, and how, whether they repurpose the thing, because if nobody's going in on Monday and Friday and the building's empty for 4 days a week, but full on Wednesdays, what do they do? So I think those things people are beginning to actually think about and how they manage that. And I think probably over the next 12, 18 months, we'll see a lot more movements because people's leases, and they'll be ready to make a decision on what to do.
Yeah.
And I think also, Steve, part something you mentioned there was that I think particularly in the States with the retail, I think it's the number of retail outlets in the US per head is phenomenal compared with everywhere else in the world. So that will hurt people as well. When you think of all the strip malls and everything else that goes with it, I think that's obviously a challenging area, which we already know. The REITs will be struggling with, as well as the commercial bit.
And
Okay, let us move on.
Back to your slide 1 second. How come there was no wired category? All the technologies for IoT were wireless only.
Well, I actually looked at that, and I kind of assumed that the rest of the numbers were 20, which basically is 20% is wired.
Right.
That's my assumption.
I always find that these numbers are suspect from these market research houses because it's a hard thing to determine, but there are an awful lot of wired ones out there as well.
Yeah, no kidding.
Right. So sorry.
I was wondering the same thing. Glad you brought it up.
All right, let's move on, shall we? Smarter networks. What's all this? What's this all about then? So I kind of thought that we normally start these months with a little bit of sort of what is this subject all about, and just have an open brainstorm. And so I thought we'd start with sort of, just sort of understanding what networking is all about, and to me, the first networking that humans had was this, and I'm wondering if anybody can guess what I'm about to show. No, you're
Carrier
wrong.
pigeons?
No,
Communication.
that's not, well, no. This is networking. I would argue this is our our ancestors a long time ago, networking around the campfire. I mean, the point here is networking is about bringing multiple entities together so that they can achieve something that they can't do on their own, right? So gathering around the fire, hunting for food, it's all sort of what networking kind of started off to be. But in terms of in the sort of technical world, really this is where networking started, the electric telegraphic network, which is claimed to have been started by Sam Morse, but in fact it was not. It was actually started by a couple of Brits, of course, that created this this device on the left here. But interestingly, it's called a needle point thing. Basically, they arrange it so that the needles point to the letter that's being transmitted. And if you think about the electronics, this is simple electronics, obviously. If you think of the electronics to do that, it's obviously multiple wires, right? So Morse came along and said, I can do it with one wire. That's innovation for you, right? You can still use the same words and everything else, but I just do it with one wire. So that's kind of that took off, because that then started the whole the creation of the network that became the telegraphic network, became Western Union, and that created a network of how we as humans can send messages to each other. That's basically what the network part of it is. The Morse code device itself is not a network, it's just a switch. Right, so this is kind of where it started, and we now live in this world. And I think I think it's important for us to spend a bit of time on this. This is a conceptual model that came out, I guess, in the 80s or thereabouts, when we were trying to figure out what networking was all about. There was the sort of the days of Novell and various other proprietary networks, and the OSI guys came up with this model. It says that there are 7 layers that is involved in networking, and it goes from physical all the way at the bottom, which is obviously like the Morse switch, or whatever that thing is called, is obviously one of those, to the frames, which in the Morse code days is presumably is kind of the dot and the dashes. That's kind of the encoding mechanism. And then the network is the packets. The packets is probably the words. You know, you can start to sort of see all the way up. And the presentation is the actual telegram itself, right? So I was trying to sort of make the two align with each other. It doesn't quite fit, because I'm not quite sure what session is and what transport is. We can have a debate about it. But the idea that networking and the act of networking is a layered sort of concept is actually quite universal, probably going back to our caveman days, but let's not try and do that. Anyway, so this is really very important. And to me, the most important thing about this 7-layer model is it specifies where things happen so that you don't confuse them. Right. So quite often, even I make some mistakes, and I think we all do. When we're talking about something, we're comparing something that's in the physical realm with something that's in the session realm, and you really can't do that, right? Because that's not how it works. You should be able to replace something in the physical realm with something else that's on the physical realm, and everything else above it should still work. And that was the case, I would presume, when we went from the needlepoint to the Morse code. Everything else above, the messages still went through, and the words are still the same words, right? So the stacking thing is actually very important. But today we don't think of the layers that much, unless you're in the business, and we just think about it as the internet, right, of nodes and the cloud. That's kind of how we've sort of simplified it. So I kind of just wanted to say that those few things, especially on this 7-layer, just to start the conversation going on what networks is all about and why it's important to us. I know, Rick, that you're you're passionate about the Morse code most thing because you kept on talking about it. I'll let you start.
Well, it seems that when we mash together all the different sort of definitions of networking and communications, yeah, to your point, quite often we're confusing accidentally using the wrong language to describe, where something is actually happening. And that's kind of why I always like to go back to the Morse code and telegraph example and then go forward to today's world where we've got multiple different kinds of networks and multiple different kinds of the 7 layers all happening in one device. And it really is worth, especially for our industry, taking the time to understand what are we specifically talking about, where the barrier is, or where the complication is, or what technology improvement are we talking about now? And most importantly, where is it going? Because the next frontier of networking is already evolving. And yet we're still in our industry, we're trying to figure out how basically to pull along a whole bunch of 100-year-old, effectively Morse code communications that isn't even packets. It's not securable for that reason. And to dig into it, to understand, where are the barriers? I think it's just really helpful to drop back to some of these fundamentals, especially when we start to realize that, we take things for granted about how we transmit data and video and text messages and voice all on one device. And then we go into a building and we talk about the difference between OT networks and IT networks, and, dropping back and understanding the fundamentals, I think, is really useful, and understanding what the challenges are and maybe what the creative solutions are. And with the new generation, as Ken says, of the digital natives or natively digital or born digital or whatever it is, the new generation of people who think about communications and networks differently,
Born
They take-
connected.
born connected, there we go. It's really important, I think, to weave in some of the newer creative thinkers who are used to how things work here and are not hindered by memories of Morse code and party lines and token passing networks. I mean, we are still, MSTP is multi-serial token passing. So when we talk about MSTP, we're talking about a 40-year-old way of packaging up data and putting it on a wire. And I'm not sure, I think it's good to drop back and understand some of the fundamentals of what we're facing in our industry and where it's going. There's my passion.
Anyone else want to jump in at this point?
I was just going to ask, I mean, when you go back to, which we're talking about, over the past sessions in terms of the cloud native, and we'll come on to IP later in the month, but that all leads towards a flatter network. But I guess when you looked at your slide that you put up, and so it actually showed that the real change is wireless connectivity. I think Jim's absolutely right. I think when you look at it, cell and Bluetooth are probably, and you mentioned they're probably more residential than commercial. But you have to assume that any of the changes that Rick was just talking about, or that happened in the home, happened and made them smarter and made the world a different place because it was wireless. It could happen quicker. There was a default standard that everything just talked to or talked at, and people, if they didn't do it, started off with one thing at home, soon found that they could connect all the others as well. So I truthfully believe that the most significant change has got to come for us from wireless. I mean, I know LoRaWAN is gaining momentum and things like that, but I can only imagine that if we're to change, and it will change quickly, it will have to come from some sort of wireless base.
Uh, there's obviously a lot behind what you're saying, Roger. But I sort of remind myself by saying wireless is layer one,
Yep.
right? Whether it's wired or wireless is all about layer one, right? It doesn't. I mean, there's some implications above in terms of wireless has certain behaviors that's different to wired, right? That gets accommodated in the upper layers, but basically it's just a change in one. So we've just changed effectively from the needle point to the Morse code because it's better.
Yeah, but what it allowed you to do is when you wanted to put speakers in your home somewhere else, rather than having to wire it through the whole house and doing something else, you could just put it down somewhere and it went.
Right.
And
So it's the
it
convenience of-
enabled the change to be much quicker.
Yeah.
And more, to some extent, much more standard, and I just think it's an enabler for the rest of it.
I think you're quite correct, Roger. It's the other thing that I'd like to point out is we went through this structured cabling thing that happened, and we have a lot of apartments, particularly residents, that have structured cabling panels inside of them. They've probably been installed at a cost of $10,000 to $20,000 a suite. And when you look inside of them, all of that cabling is abandoned and there's a wireless router. I think that's the significance of the wireless, is that it just replaces so much of that existing wiring network. And even if it does have a few blips in it and it isn't, somebody points out that certain things it doesn't communicate. We're the same thing with our cell phones. We forgive our cell phones because they're so damn useful that we are willing to invest in wireless. So yes, I think the wireless is a bit of a game changer.
If you were going to invest in creating some end devices or IoT devices that you want to add to that number you had, those billions of things there. And so would you actually be looking at a wired end device? Probably not.
In most cases, no.
Well, I think what it really impacted, though, Roger, that what wireless really meant from home and IoT and all those spaces, but really for me meant two things. One, deployment costs, right? It made a significant impact on the deployment costs. At the end of the day, everything up the top of the stack, still the same, right? Applications are still the same. But the deployment cost, which is a big challenge in our space, right? I mean, when the BAS guys do their work, a large part of their cost is deployment cost because they have to put in infrastructure that has to last 20, 25 years, and it makes sense. But the other one that it really drove was what I call the proof of concept challenge, right? Every time you come through with a new application and you're trying to prove, and the way that we describe it is, you go to the customer, you do your demo, you do your case studies, you do your reference projects, you show your stuff, you show your demo project. The customer goes, yeah, that's great, but I want to see it working in my environment. And what wireless did was allowed you to do a really quick proof of concept in his environment. I could deploy a quick few sensors and I could prove the value of the application that I'm doing in a space of, weeks versus many, many months that we had to do from a wired perspective, and which also brought down. So it's to me, it's what wireless really did was those two. How do you reduce the deployment costs and how do you increase the proof of concept sales cycle, right? Which is, no matter what anyone says, nobody in our industry ever buys things off spec or off a reference project or just because you said so. They all kind of go down this, I got to make it work in my environment. And then you get stuck in the proof of concept death loop, where, well, I can't pay for it. I expect you to be able to do that. So again, wireless has enabled that as well, because now I've taken out the cost of doing the POC to a minimum, as much as possible.
Well, I share everyone's enthusiasm for wireless and costs and everything else. We find extreme pushback in cyber secure environments where people are just saying no, that they can't manage it, supervise it, or keep on top of it well enough. So it's just outright forbidden. So it's some of these healthcare, pharma and life sciences, military, these other mission critical projects, I'm looking at wired for a long, long time to come.
So just on that, this is a great opportunity to ask the dumb question. Is it that they can't, it's not that they can't manage the wireless radio signal. It's they can't is it that they can't manage the packets of data that's being sent over it?
No, they can. They just they are worried about cybersecurity. So although they can, you know, if you were to use Wi-Fi or LoRa, you can use TCP/IP packets and TCP/IP encryption and authorization and regular security standards. But in the case of military or life sciences or healthcare, they're afraid that the signal can be jammed, right? The drones crash because they jam the signals. And so there are other kinds of security besides someone breaking in. There's just the ability to disrupt, you know, when somebody turns on an arc welder in the building next door and the heart lung machine stops.
I wonder with Jim, would that be an 80-20 thing where 20% of the people won't accept it because of those sort of issues, but 80% of the normal commercial buildings or whatever will, providing there is a reasonable level of security on the network.
I think you're absolutely right, Roger. I think that in those commercial cases, it could be fine, but I think that there will just be some classes of customers that say no to wireless.
Yeah, and when you put wireless in, it's almost assumed it's going to be multi-application, if you will. So fine if you want to. The assumption is if you're going to use it for, say, the building automation system or any of the OT systems, it's also being used for just general purpose computing and for people's cell phones. So that's from a security standpoint, Jim. That to me is probably why they get very nervous around that, because that same signal is carrying multiple channels or flavors of data, and you don't typically, at least I'm not aware of, where people put in dedicated Wi-Fi to specific use cases.
You're right, Steve.
Yeah.
So Toby posted a question, Q&A, which is really more of a comment about observation that Bob Metcalf made a long time ago. And it's really something that I've seen over and over again in the tech world, is that networks and systems are increasingly being designed to work on intermittent, poor quality physical layer, basically what it is, right? Toby is talking here about just recall that the very beginning of the internet, we're at sort of 110 to 300 baud networks, which is like, super slow. I can forgive people of not even knowing what a baud is, but anyway, bits per second. It's actually bits per second, not bytes per second, right? It's bits per second.
Yeah.
So it's very slow. So that's kind of interesting that in a way this stack lets that happen, lets things get lost and reconstructed. That's what TCP/IP is all about. And there are different layers, and it's almost like this networking layer is there all the time, as Rick pointed out, and yet we're always up there. We never, as consumers or even as a business consumer, we're always at the application layer all the time, right? Whenever we use a network, we're actually an application, or we use an application, right? So a lot of technologies have actually been focused on making the applications work regardless of what happens underneath. So it's kind of interesting because there's an issue about wireless, which enables a lot of networking to happen because of the physical layer. And yet a lot of the value out of networking is actually extracted only at the application level, where there's lots of different technologies that people are putting in there. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, but it kind of helps also to, deal with all those issues of normalizing stuff, because guess what, you've got video cameras or Ring doorbells and things at home, which your 300 baud rate network wouldn't have coped with. And in fact, a lot of the networks that are installed today just wouldn't cope with the video either. So
Right.
it kind of makes it more of a leveler of the different technologies that may be used. Yeah.
Well, isn't it also true that we were talking about some of the shortcuts and time to deployment or Rana was that some of these home systems and some of the things that the younger generation is used to, it's like, well, it just works. It shows up on my phone. It connects through Wi-Fi. I don't really care what happens between layer 1 and 7.
They're using at the application level, it just works.
Yep.
For them.
Right. But the fact is, we're using multiple different things in 2 through 6 that are hard to normalize and hard to manage. And a lot of folks just take a real shortcut, I'm not gonna worry about using standard TCP, for instance. BACnet is not TCP/IP protocol. But again, does that matter? Yeah, it matters when you start to try and figure out how you're going to manage all these different packets that are flying through the wires or flying through the air.
I
And
think
that's-
that, I think, Rick, the way I'd put it is that as an industry, if you look at the progression that Anto's taken us through from the caveman to where we are today, people have tried different technologies for control. We started out with no control, then we went to mechanical control, then we went to pneumatic control, then we went to DDC. And as we've been along that progression, innovators, people at companies have been basically looking at the innovation in IT, just as you say, on that side. And what we've been trying to do is use as much of that innovation as possible. And in fact, that's what BACnet has done. It actually predates the internet. So it's actually done a reasonable job of keeping up with that. And as it goes forward, it's also making those changes. The problem comes about when you look at the applications that are available. And I think that in our industry, it's actually not the lower layers that are causing the traffic jam right now. It's people perpetually trying to add some kind of proprietary lock to the top of the architectures. And this is why something like the IBB is so critical. Because if you continue to look at this, people are going to say, okay, well, we understand that BACnet has the field level devices and up. But what we really need to do now is take those data definitions proprietary and take the applications that we're working on and make sure they're all proprietary so that in fact, other people can't get at the data at the top. So it's really, I would argue that it's actually not the lower parts of the stack, but the action and the problem is occurring at the top. Anto, can you add to that?
You said that beautifully, and that's what I was trying to get to when trying to bring some focus to the top. It's kind of where the action is for us, because BACnet, when you actually think of BACnet, you think of field bus and you think, oh, that's kind of a lower layer thing. No, it's not. MSTP is. MSTP cables are down here. The data link is down here, but BACnet IP uses UDP, which is up here in level 4, and SC, BACnet SC basically is at the SSL level up there in presentation, I think, right? Right. So, and the secured by Symmetrics and managed BACnet related stuff are basically up the top, right? So that's why I find the sort of the discussion and debate about wireless, why I totally get the installation, the impact on installation. it's actually not where the problems are in terms of integrating and making all of these systems work when you actually think about complex buildings. So it's not, it impact the lower levels wireless impacts it, but really the most meaningful impacts is at the top, especially when we're thinking about semantics and meanings of data.
And I think that there's a lot of really good reason for this, which is that, when BACnet was standardized in the first place, the industry pushed back very hard on standardizing configuration tools and programming languages because they wouldn't have any proprietary added value. If you go into a business and you standardize and commoditize everything, you end up with nothing. And in fact, if you look at Apple or Microsoft or any of the large IT systems, they're trying the exact same thing. And if you look at their approach to cloud, they're trying the exact same thing, which is why you have AWS and you have Azure. These are proprietary platforms where people are trying to basically create an ecosystem where they can add proprietary value and get economic traction. And that basically is the same case in our industry. The question is you have to decide, okay, if we're all in business, I am, we need to find some added value with some area which produces a return on investment for our investors. So where's that line going to be drawn? And I would make the argument now that the line is still drawn too low to liberate value from the data that's down below.
So Jim, picking up on that thought, I hadn't really, like Anto, hadn't thought too much about some of the middle layers in the OSI stack. And I just looked up layer 5, which is session. And when you define it, it says it's the layer of the ISO that controls the dialogues / connections between computers. It establishes, manages, and terminates the connections between the local and remote application. Isn't that what we're trying to do with the IBB?
I think that that is one of the things that we're trying to do with the IBB. Anto, go ahead.
But the point that I'll just finish up quickly is that,
go ahead. Go ahead.
Just like wireless has sort of in many ways revolutionized the layer 1, the physical layer. I'm not aware of anything in our industry or in IT in general that has looked at the session layer in particular. Tremendous stuff at application and presentation and so on, but the session seems like maybe this is the place we need to focus on because it could potentially solves this problem of how we get all these applications to play nicely together.
Well, 5 is on the slide that I have is the synchronization of things. Obviously, APIs and sockets and WinSockets are there. APIs, sockets, and WinSockets are 3 very big technologies that we use all the time in buildings and outside, but we don't actually think about them a lot. When we're using our phone, we're basically using APIs all the time. And sockets, we're now on Zoom. Each of us has now got a socket to Zoom somewhere. So that's how that's all done. You're sort of asking if the IBB is a layer 5 thing. I don't know. I was actually just thinking earlier where IBB fits into this, because obviously in many ways it has some of the physical attributes. It has quite a bit of the lower levels because it needs to as a networking thing. Is it not the whole stack? Because it
is.
But it's not trying to be applications or presentation necessarily, right?
No.
Well, but an application could be in the IBB.
Yeah, okay, as a device that can host it. But I'm saying
Right.
the functionality is providing, if I understand correctly, is to make it possible for any type of application to gain access to the data across all these different OT systems and in a common common accepted format, right?
Right, which basically is the middle layers. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, 6 and 7 are kind of options that could be in it, but not necessary kind of thing.
Yeah, right.
Okay, that's good. So some of the challenges, Steve, a lot of the reasoning that we're talking about network, you raised it a few weeks back in our planning call. What was the thing that was driving you to sort of suggest this? Because you were very passionate about wanting to have a discussion about networks.
Yeah, well, the primary reason is that the OT industry is moving rapidly away from its traditional serial bus communications to putting everything on IP backbones. And whether they, in some cases, they're drag kicking and screaming, right? But it's happening, and for many reasons. And so once you go there, it raises the bar in terms of the skill levels and the knowledge that is required to deploy IP networks, and that's inevitably where you immediately run into the IT departments who are start questioning what you're doing, how you're doing it, and of course the cybersecurity issues that then come along with it. So that's I felt I wouldn't say dodging the issue. I think we need to embrace it and really look at what, acknowledge the trend. It's inevitable. It's happening. More and more manufacturers are coming out with full lines of IP-based controllers at the unitary level. And so the way they're being architected, the way they're being installed, there's a whole learning curve that I felt we should spend a month talking about, because there's just so much there, whether it's just trying to make it all work, just, how do I connect it all up so it works? And then when I deal with the IT department, what do I need to be able to talk to them about? Because in many cases, they're gonna be questioning what you're doing. And so we need to spend time on those networks that involve the IT departments as opposed to standalone OT networks. So I just think we've reached the point where we can no longer, we just need to give it its due. It's time.
I would also add that, as we've seen this convergence between IT and OT systems, we're way down the road with that now. As Steve just said, almost every manufacturer has a large fraction of their offering, at least going forward, that's IP centric. And at large enterprise customers that I deal with, this synchro meshing of the two worlds is in mid swing right now. And most of the large building automation companies have large teams of network engineers that are helping deploy their building automation projects on these IP networks right now.
Right.
So when we come up to the other end of the market, not the home Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, small building sector, when we come up to large buildings and enterprise buildings, this is a very hot topic.
And of course, as we move on, a number of those sections on layers here will be bundled into the one sort of edge product anyway, as it moves. The costs of components move down and the intelligence moves down, and you start getting more and more intelligent edge devices. So they'll be coping with a lot more of this stuff at that level too.
Which is really at the top level, because when it gets collapsed, all you see is the top of it, right?
Yep.
Or the bottom of it, depending on which way you're looking.
I mean, it's all the bits in between when you actually take what is a user or someone who utilizes what we provide, it kind of, they're kind of interested how they get it together at one, but they're really only 1 and 7 are the only things they ever see or are interested in. All the bits in between is no different than the app on your phone. All this is going on underneath, as Rick was saying earlier, but you just see that, the whole idea of that was make it easy to use.
So it sort of almost begs the question, what's more important, the top, looking at it from the top or from the bottom?
I think looking at it from the top is more important. And frankly, you know, this picture is also a 40-year-old picture at this point. And I think Smarter Stack is actually a better way to look at problems. And I believe that we will have finished commoditizing these layers for our industry within the next 5 years. So we're long down the road of figuring out how this is all going to get done seamlessly. But from the perspective of how people provide value in applications to owners, that's a wide open space. As I said, there are lots of people that have their eye on some kind of proprietary control of that space. Anytime you hear the word platform used, and you're not waiting for a train, look out for the proprietary lock-in.
And I think you came up with a great sort of phrase there as well, indication there. Jimmy is saying, really all these bits in between here will get commoditized because there'll be some de facto way of it happening, and therefore you won't even need to think about it on how you're going to apply your products to get stuff and data up to the application level.
Correct. I think we're well down the road on that now.
And what's interesting is you compare this to the Smarter Stack. I know they're not comparable. This is a network. The other one's a really business stack. So put that out first. But the application layer that we have is actually nowhere near the top. It's actually got 3 levels above the application. We have the delivery and the operation and the purpose above the application, which supports basically the argument that I think Jim and I are making, is the application and above is where the action is.
Correct.
And it's where all the investment's going right now, you know, when you're looking at it in the industry.
But it's also where the value can be
Yep.
extracted out of the network, right? If you
Yep.
go back to the caveman picture, the application is fire and having fish to eat or whatever, right? That's at the top. That's the only thing that's so valuable.
Yep.
So, you know, looking ahead to the rest of the month, I think we had talked about the next week, maybe focusing on the practical aspects of deploying networks. And I think I would really like to see us do that. In other words, how do you deploy? What are the issues involved, and what are the skills in deploying IP networks and buildings? So, because it beyond the cabling, beyond whether you use wireless to some degree or not, there's real constraints in buildings based on where our gear is located, right? And how you actually get one node to talk to another node, right? Particularly if you were trying to use wireless and use Wi-Fi specifically. And then of course you want to get the data out of the building, so you need to typically get to, you know, some sort of cellular connection. And what's involved in doing that? So there's multiple facets here that I think deserve some airtime, is my argument.
So that's really the bottom 3 or 4.
Yeah,
It's right.
correct.
Probably certainly up to the network layer.
So kind of what you're saying, Steve, if your chiller's in the basement and your cooling tower's on the roof, you know, all the bits that in between to get them working in unison is what you want to talk about a little bit.
Yeah, I think it's worth going over, because we got very accustomed to being able to run RS-45 long distances, relatively speaking, right? And Ethernet doesn't allow for that. It's got much shorter distance, so now you got to put in, you know, repeats. So there's just the practical side of this that is worthy of some time and discussion, I think.
Mm-hmm.
But the objective of that conversation is moving IP traffic.
Correct.
Right?
Exactly.
So that's why in that conversation, this is good, because we're using the layers
Right.
where we're supposed to. We're not really as much focused on the applications. We're assuming that there's some application, but it's more about how we construct and create and actually make the network work as a network to get stuff to and from the pieces, so the devices that need to have access, right?
Right.
It's okay. Just reading Keith Gibson's
Hmm.
long email along
Right.
if we had more time, I'd bring you on, Keith, but we're just wrapping up. So maybe if you join us next week, you can chime in a lot of thoughts there. Okay.
And I guess as Jim indicated, we're getting a long way down the route here with all this stuff now, and we're, as with everything else we've kind of talked about since we even started these sessions, is we're in transition now. It's how quickly this lot moves as well, you know, and the more and more applications, you know, a few years ago all the applications were kind of tended to be on site, you know, now it's off-prem, and that's where all these applications are, to actually get the data into the hands of people who know how to do it instead of stuck on a PC in the basement.
Just as a reminder, I know Melissa is not joining us on this call, but you know, her business, her training program, the one she's just recently launched for cybersecurity, includes a full quarterly session on networking. Is because, you know, the importance of getting individuals through the learning curve of how to architect and deploy IP networks is critical, because if you don't know how to do it, you're going to potentially put your building at risk from a cyber perspective. So yeah, it's anyway. I don't want to keep beating the same tune here over and over again, but I think it's just worthy of discussion to the degree that we could get some individuals to add to the discussion who are actually doing this in the field and talking about the challenges and how they're solving them would be really, I think, very good for our Monday Live audience.
Okay, so we'll continue this next week on how do we move IP around, which is really focused on the lower half of this stack. And then we said that on the following week after that, we want to be turning the conversation more into how do we manage networks from a organization perspective. If you're an organization, whether you own a building or you're providing services to a building, how do you manage everything? Because there's a lot here.
Right.
Yeah. And then on the last week, we can talk about the future and do a little bit of blue sky thinking.
Okay. Cool.
Cool. So hopefully this has helped sort of uncover a little bit of the basics of what network's all about. I think we've sort of identified where we want to talk about and identify the issues. So I think it's good. Anybody have any closing comments? I'll take that as a no. So good. Hope everybody has a good week, and we'll get back next week, and we'll get a video out of this tomorrow sometime.
Sounds
Okay.
good.
Thank
Take care,
you,
everyone.
Bye-bye.
You guys.